Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. It's time for another hometown episode. As you may know, some time ago I put out a challenge, name any town, any city, any location on planet Earth and I will find a UFO encounter there, probably more than one. And that's what I've been doing. I've covered 10 episodes so far, nearly 100 locations, so this episode is called UFOs in Your Hometown, episode 11. I love doing these hometown episodes. They take a little bit more research than the other episodes, but I always learn so much. Today I'm covering 4 locations. Usually I cover 8, maybe 10, but I just found so many encounters that really this is all I can fit in. And the 4 locations I'm covering today include Vancouver in British Columbia, Canada, Lake Havasu in Arizona, Thomasville in North Carolina, and finally the Isle of Wight in the UK. These cases go back well over 100 years. What I love about these episodes is that they include the entire range of encounters. So we have sightings, mostly of metallic craft, but also USOs, landings, face-to-face encounters with humanoids, onboard encounters, a couple of what appear to be UFO crash retrievals, and just so many different types of cases. What's also interesting is the huge amount of evidence in support of these cases, which includes physiological effects, landing traces, animal reactions, electromagnetic disturbances, radar returns, photographs, you name it. So, with these 4 locations, this is going to be a pretty long episode. I found so many different types of encounters, but the first one I am covering today includes Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. This is by special request from Ian and Oreo. So thank you guys for suggesting this location. I know you were very patient waiting for this, but it was a very difficult location to research simply because there were so many encounters. I investigated probably, or I'm presenting here, about 20 cases, which is by no means comprehensive. I seriously could write an entire book on just the cases in Vancouver, which is a pretty large area. Let's see, it's got about 45 square miles, not super large, but very densely populated, with some 2 to 3 million people in Vancouver proper, but in the outlying areas, millions of people. So it should come as no surprise that there are a lot of UFO encounters, but again, pretty much the entire range of UFO phenomena. The earliest case I could find in Vancouver is actually a humanoid case, and it comes from Abram Penner, who in 1972 wrote a letter to researcher J. Allen Hynek. He wrote that one morning, way back in 1912, while on his father's farm in Vancouver, he saw a round craft which he said was, quote, something like a helicopter. He said it had a glass cab on top, and he said it landed on the ground and, quote, spacemen came out. Now, as he says in his own words, one man felt my body. They admired my hands. They have different hands than we do. They have round feet, short legs, no knees, no elbows. They operate on mind power. I understood what they said. Now, there's no other information on this case, unfortunately. It's quite brief. Other than Abraham did tell his father what happened, and his father warned him to never tell anyone. And he didn't, not for 60 years, when he finally wrote this letter to J. Allen Hynek. Now, reportedly, researcher John Brent Musgrave did speak personally with this witness and wrote about this account in his book. Next case, March 1933. This is a rare report of an apparent UFO crash. In the days before this incident, there was a series of sightings seen by some 70 people in a suburban area of Vancouver. The main witness is an 88-year-old man by the name of Donald, so all this information comes from him. Reportedly, people were seeing a semicircular object with what looked like a triangular base, about 100 feet wide, 20 feet high, and after this series of sightings, this object came hurtling down and apparently crash-landed in a field, causing some kind of an explosion. Witnesses rushed to the scene, and they were there within 5 minutes of this explosion. When they got there, no object was seen, but they reportedly found 3 bodies. Now, these were never described. From this point, the details in this case become pretty sparse, but per Donald, he says that 5 people in this area disappeared under mysterious circumstances, including Michael Farlow, Justin Avery, Cindy Bellsworth, Kathy Johnson, and a few days later, her husband, Brandon Johnson. Now, whether this is connected in any way to the incident is certainly implied, but it's not clear. This was allegedly reported to the police and appeared in the Tamworth Herald newspaper. But as the witness Donald says, none of them were ever seen again. So I don't know. The next case occurred in the summer of 1939, still quite early, and it comes from a first-hand witness who at age 15 says that she had a very close-up sighting of a UFO from the front yard of her home, located on West 5 Avenue in the Vancouver suburb of Kitsilano. She kept this encounter secret for most of her life, only telling her son Mark about 5 years before she passed away in February of 1995. But he recorded her encounter, and as she says, quote, "It came from behind the cloud and came at fast speed. It stopped above the house across the street. It looked like a tube, a metallic tube. No sound, no wings, nothing. It was a bit bigger than the house. I ran inside to get my dad, and he said he did not know what it was. Then it left straight up and was gone in a flash. This all happened in about a 3-minute time period, and my dad told me not to tell anyone, so I didn't." Now, incidentally, her father was an employee of Boeing and very familiar with aircraft. And as her son Mark says, "When she told me the story, there was a tone in her voice that said it still scared her, even though she wouldn't admit it." The next case that I found, which is pretty interesting, occurred in the summer of 1955. And this is told by someone who spoke to the witness, so it's technically a third-hand report, but it's so compelling, I think it deserves mention. The witnesses were 6 children, ranging in age from 12 to 14, and as the man who made the report writes, "About 6 of my friends were sitting out in their backyard. All of a sudden, they noticed a large cigar-shaped craft coming slowly up from the south. One of them ran into the house and brought out binoculars, as well as his mother. They stated that the craft had numerous yellow portholes along both sides. Their mother apparently phoned the airport and was told that there were no planes in the air at that time. They said that while she was on the phone, she could hear fighter planes being scrambled in the background. But while she was inside, this craft slowly turned around and headed back south, and they watched it until it was out of sight." So an interesting report of a solid craft of some kind. Next one, some 9 years later, June 1964. This case is interesting because it involves some unusual electromagnetic effects. It was around 3 a.m., again one evening in June, when 2 brothers had a close-up sighting of a very large craft. Writes one of the witnesses, "My brother and I were watching this object fly over our house in East Vancouver at 41st and Fraser Street. We watched this object for about 2 minutes, and then it vanished off to the south. The object was long, like a mother ship." Now, the most amazing part is what happened after this. As the witness says, 2 weeks later, my buddy Mike was driving south on Cambie Street at 12th Avenue. He looked up above City Hall and saw 5 or 10 objects stationary above City Hall. He told me that they were like, quote, a disc, all in formation. Now, just about the same time he saw this, streetlights, cars, truck engines all shut down almost as soon as this happened. Then the lights went back on, the engines restarted, and the objects were gone. Here is an astonishing close-up sighting of a massive daylight disk. This occurred one day in August of 1968. A newly engaged couple were driving through Vancouver when an object began to follow their car and continued to do so for about 6 blocks, all the way to their house. They got out and this object stopped and hovered overhead. Now the witnesses described this object as, quote, a large saucer shape with large triangular-shaped windows on top. The bottom had a smaller protrusion, a dome, and no window. There were what looked like symbols written and lights on the outer rim. But the windows were lit up brighter than daylight. They heard a slight droning noise. They said this was not at a distance. This thing was huge and close up. It was a gray steel color. It appeared to be about 3 city blocks long. Now this is still quoting the witness. As they said, this UFO was not at such a distance that you had to guess what it was. It was in your face. You could see in the windows. You could see the lights around the outside as well as writing. It was huge. When we arrived home, it was at the same distance away, which was close enough to see in the windows. My fiancée and my neighbors, as well as my dad, just stood there saying nothing for at least 2 minutes. It took off slowly, then so fast it almost disappeared. I know what I saw, and it was not from here. I know it was following my wife and I. This has bothered me for years. I do not want people thinking I am nuts. Now, it was that same month, again, August 1968, there was an amazing case involving a landing and a humanoid. There was a group of young friends playing around with their BB guns at the Shaughnessy Golf Course, which you can see here, when they came upon a silver round craft, which they said was about the size of a VW Beetle, just sitting on the green. One of the witnesses, Kim, walked up to it and began to bang on it as if he were playing bongo drums. He was trying to impress his friends. But then he walked around it and got a big shock when he saw a 4-foot-tall humanoid standing next to this little craft. And as he says, he was so pale, he was nearly blue, and had a white suit on that had a blue sash around his waist. I said, "My name is Kim," and I put my right hand on my heart as I said it. And he responded by holding his hands palms up and made a sound, but he didn't seem to have a tongue. At one point, he put out his right arm and nodded for me to do the same with my left, and I was allowed to compare my hand with his. And except for the pallor, we were very similar. At this point, I heard a voice in my head that spoke the words, "Would you like to pray?" And he bowed and put his arms pointing down with his palms towards me. I was a bit embarrassed, and to get a laugh from my friends, who were literally stunned, I made a gesture to the BB gun in my right pocket. He seemed to sense this, and now I had to apologize for this and explain that it was only a BB gun, not real, and he seemed to understand. I said a few more things, then waved, and he waved back, and I joined my friends. Now the witness does not say what happened next, but he does say that following this, he had an encounter while walking along Vancouver Street and was actually taken up inside a craft via a beam of light. As he says, I had a medical exam and was very ill for up to 10 days after. I was called by the Bigelow Group and spoke at length about this to Bill Jones. I have had 3 other sightings. Again, the kind of case I wish I had a lot more information on, but certainly interesting. And here's another one. This is in July of 1970, around 7 p.m. one evening. It's a truly bizarre case who says that this witness stepped out of his home located at 484 Gordon Avenue, and weird things began to immediately happen. As he says, I hadn't taken more than a few steps when I started noticing small silver balls around the size of golf balls coming over the top of the house. That was on the adjacent street that ran the other way from my street, about a half a block away. They passed at all different heights. One even grazed my ankle. I glanced to my right towards my house, and I noticed that the cat had come out of the house behind me. It was extremely startled. I could hear them, these little silver balls, I could hear them crashing through the trees and bushes behind me. They almost seemed to move more like animals than something mechanical. They made a sort of shishing sound. So this is a fleet of tiny little orb-like UFOs. Very odd. Now here is an interesting case which occurred in 1977 to a very young witness. She was only 5 years old, but says she remembers this vividly. Again, one night in 1977, she and her mother were driving westbound on West 6th Street towards Mahan, and you can see this intersection here. She was sitting in the front passenger seat, and reaching this intersection, there was St. Edmund's Parish Church, which again you can see here. And they both saw an object hovering at very low elevation directly above the church steeple. And as the witness says, I didn't know what it was. I had never seen or heard of such things, nor did I know they existed. Mom went quiet. She stopped the car, stared a moment, then turned the car right around. I was so confused. She said she didn't know what it was. It was about the size of 10 or more cars, all silver, and it had white lights all around its edges. You could see them rotating with the craft very slowly directly above the church cross. I had no idea what it was. We drove straight home. Mom asked me to go tell my father what we had seen. I had no clue. So I went to the kitchen, grabbed 2 cereal bowls and put them rim to rim. And he said it was a UFO. He also told me it wouldn't hurt me, but I had nightmares for months. Very close encounter there. Here's another one in 1977, April 20, 1977. This case actually found its way into several newspapers and journals, I think because the witnesses were trained observers. Their names were George Thrupp and Margaret Mancor. They were both weather officers employed at the Vancouver Weather Office. It was after midnight. Their shift had just ended, and they were driving their car out of the Vancouver International Airport when they saw a bright blue flash of light towards South Vancouver. And looking up, they both saw a cigar-shaped object, orange on top and brilliant blue on the bottom, and it had a row of dark portholes along the side. They said it appeared to be huge, larger than a Boeing 747 jumbo jet, and they would know, being trained observers. But as George Thrupp says, we saw the thing so plain. It was traveling as fast as a jet fighter, and there was no sound at all. And Margaret Mancor says, I was so stunned. It was so fast I didn't get a good look at it. It was a hazy blue, and it didn't make a noise. Both said it frightened them so badly that they had trouble sleeping for weeks after the incident. So many cases. Here's an impressive multiple witness sighting which occurred in 1978. The main witness is Sandy. She was 4 years old at the time of her encounter and was sitting on the couch with her 2 older siblings when all 3 of them simultaneously noticed a UFO hovering outside. They don't describe it in any detail, but they do say they jumped up screaming and ran outside on the street to watch this thing. And by the time they got out there was already a crowd of their neighbors watching this object. And in fact, their next-door neighbor had a camera and was furiously snapping photographs of this object. After just a few moments, this craft darted away very quickly, disappearing from view in about 2 to 3 seconds. Now, according to the witness, the next day, their neighbor, who had taken many photos, said that 3 men showed up at his house and confiscated his camera and film. So needless to say, these photographs have never been seen publicly. All right, moving along. 1985. I like this case because it's a schoolyard UFO encounter. As you may know, I wrote a whole book on schoolyard UFO encounters. This one's not in there, though. So many schoolyard cases. This involves a class of 8-year-olds, second graders, who were in a portable detached classroom separate from the main building, of course in Vancouver, when, during the middle of their lessons, someone looked out the window and shouted out, "Whoa!" All the students and the teachers rushed out and saw what appeared to be a sort of plane-like object. The problem was it was at very low altitude over the school field, and it also appeared to be hovering in place. It was so large that it stretched from the field over the top of the school itself. There's not a lot of detail on this, whether there was noise or exactly what this object looked like, but the witness does admit it could have been a military plane, but as he says, this was a very strange encounter. He's looking for other witnesses who may have seen this thing. Next case, 1990. This one involves a humanoid. This 7-year-old witness says that he and his family were staying at the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Vancouver. He was sleeping between his parents on a large king bed in the hotel room when he woke up in the early morning to see a very small figure standing at the foot of the bed. And as he says, the figure was very short and skinny. I remember how tiny and fragile it looked. It had grayish pink, smooth skin. Although it was very dark, it was almost glowing in a way. It had darkish eyes, and I could tell it was staring at me. I remember looking at it, startled, but not afraid. I blinked, and it sort of just vanished. For my entire life since, I have never seen anything like it. It's an interesting case. It sounds like a gray ET, and strange that it's seen in a hotel room, but I have to tell you I have many other cases of that, and as any UFO researcher will tell you, an encounter can happen anywhere. Here's another really interesting case. This occurred on January 15, 1997. It was 6 a.m. Now, after seeing a strange white light a few days earlier, the witness saw it again. But this time it seemed to approach her house. Suddenly it was stationary right outside her window and started flashing a row of multicolored lights. She said green, orange, and red, and it was close enough that she could hear a whooshing noise coming from it. Now, panicked, she was on the second floor. She grabbed her baby, ran downstairs, and called 911. The officer who answered the phone asked her a few questions and transferred her call to the Chilliwack Air Force Base. So the witness again explained her encounter to the person who answered the phone, and they transferred her call again, this time to, get this, NORAD. So the witness told her story for the third time, and the person on the line said that they would call her back later. Now, that afternoon, she did receive a call from an Air Force captain who said that they had found, quote, nothing in your area, and then kind of gaslit her by saying, we don't believe in UFOs, so it must have been a meteor that you saw. Clearly not a meteor if it's flashing colored lights and it's right outside your window. That same year, a few months later, June 13, 1997, a truly spectacular sighting occurred that night when a lady was babysitting her grandson. This is a real poignant encounter. It was about 11 p.m. She had just gone to bed when she noticed this cluster of white lights at about, she estimates, 2,000 feet over the city. But it was weird because it did not appear to be moving. She assumed at first it was a plane and closed her eyes to go to sleep, but opening her eyes shortly later, she now noticed that this object was larger and closer, and these lights were now flashing different colors: gold, red, pink, and blue, and it was also sending down beams of light. So she walked up to the window, and she could now see that this was not just lights. It was a solid object. She said it was shaped much like a hamburger. She was babysitting her grandson, so she woke him up, and he joined her at the window and started to tremble and cry with fear. She immediately reassured him and told him, quote, it was not dangerous, and I would protect him from it. She found a pair of binoculars, and they each took turns looking at this object, which she said was huge. She estimates about the size of two 747s. Now, right below this object, she could see a black mass, which appeared to be flashing out bolts of electricity. And after several minutes, they saw what looked like a giant red building-sized object come out from the black mass and dart across the sky so fast it was gone in 2 seconds. Immediately, this hamburger-shaped object began to fade, as did this dark mass. But the witness says that she was more excited than frightened. And as she says, "This experience was so powerful. I felt as though it gave me a new lease on life. I cannot explain the experience. It was so wonderfully nourishing. This was the most spectacular sighting that I have ever seen." Case after case after case. Here's another one, May 15, the year 2000. It was 10:50 p.m. as two men, Pete and Louie, were star watching on the roof of Pete's condo in North Vancouver. One had a pair of powerful binoculars and the other had a telescope. Suddenly, Louie shouts out, "What the hell is that?" They both look and immediately see this large, black, V-shaped object, which was moving very quickly in perfect silence. They could see it in great detail. Both noticed that the bottom of this V had 3 triangle shapes on each arm and one at the apex. It was only in view for about 10 seconds, but certainly long enough for them to estimate that it was at about 1,000 feet altitude and about 140 feet long and wide. Louis in particular said that the whole experience left him with an unsettled feeling and, quote, "the heebie-jeebies." I can imagine. 1 year later, sometime May of 2001, actually April morning in 2001, there were 2 brothers, aged 7 and 9. They were in their bedroom getting dressed when movement through the bedroom skylight caught their eyes, and they saw 2 objects, which you can see here, with the appearance kind of quote, brown Idaho potatoes. These 2 objects zoomed silently past the skylight, and this sighting lasted only a few seconds. But here's where it gets interesting, because for 10 minutes afterwards, one of the brothers complained to his mother that he was hearing a, quote, mumbling conversation in his head. So this sounds like telepathic communication. And what's also very interesting is it wasn't the end, because 1 month later, on May 7, 2001, again in the morning, they saw another, even stranger-looking UFO. This one was very close, about 30 feet from their house, they estimate. They watched it for just 15 seconds. You can see their drawing of it here. They said it looked kind of like a jellyfish, almost had a jelly-like texture. They estimated it was about 25 feet across. And again, that wasn't their only sighting. A couple of years later, they saw another one of these potato-looking objects again. So clearly some kind of contact is going on here. That same year, another interesting case. Again, this is quite brief, but certainly dramatic, because it involves a daylight disk. June 25, 2001, around 10:30 a.m., the witness was walking along Georgia Street in North Vancouver when they saw a large silver disc-shaped craft. Sort of your classic flying saucer. It had a dome on top, was highly reflective, enough so that he could see the image of the clouds reflecting on its surface. And again, huge. He estimates that it was about 5 times the size of a 747. He watched it for about 20 seconds when it went into a cloud bank and never came out. Here's another really interesting case, October 31st, 2003. Per the witness, it was 3 a.m. when he noticed a strange object which appeared to be hovering just a few hundred feet over English Bay in the Stanley Park area of Vancouver. This is a huge park. Now he could instantly see this was your classic flying saucer. He said it had numerous colored lights rotating around the circumference, red, orange, green, blue, yellow, white, very much your classic saucer. He said it made no sound and was moving so slowly in a kind of wobbling motion. Sometimes it would hover. He guessed it was about 1 mile away, but he lost sight of it when it moved behind a building. He also noted that this thing was so visible, so obvious, that anyone who was in this area had to have seen it. But as far as he knows, he's the only witness. One final case. I did cover this before, but it is in Vancouver, so I'll repeat it. This was February 12, 2015. It comes from Canadian researcher and author Nathaniel Brislin, and is featured in his book, Crawlers, a Conclusive Casebook. It's a humanoid case. That's why I wanted to include it. The witness, Ellie, is anonymous. It was early in the evening. She was taking a nap while her boyfriend went out to get some food, and she woke up to hear the familiar sound of what she thought was him walking up the stairs. Turned out it wasn't him at all. She was still a bit groggy as she got out of bed. She knocked over a can on her bed table and went to the glass doors leading to the stairs, and as she did, she was shocked to see a very tall figure standing in front of her. She said it was so tall she had to crane her neck upwards to see it. She's estimating 8 or 9 feet tall. She said it had a skinny body, pale white beige skin, incredibly long arms and fingers, didn't see any mouth, but she did see that it had a large, oval, bald head and huge dark eyes, and seemed to be glowing with white, yellow light, bright enough to illuminate the hallway, and was holding its arms out towards her as if asking for a hug. So this really shocked her, as you can imagine, and she was really surprised that this wasn't her boyfriend. And now, seeing its long arms and fingers reaching out, she was afraid it was going to touch her. But very quickly, her response to it changed, and she was amazed to find that she wasn't scared of it at all. And instead, she felt strong feelings of calmness, tranquility, even caring and love. And she found herself returning back to bed very calmly. She says it's almost like it sensed her fear and was stretching out its arms and saying, "Stay calm, behave, it's all right." She had the sense that the being was incredibly powerful and felt almost like a young child while in its presence, like she had to be respectful to it. She said she almost felt drugged as she crawled back into bed, but glancing back to her doorway, it was gone. Well, there you go, guys, especially Ian and Oreo. Thank you again for suggesting that location. I learned a lot, so many different types of cases. Once again, proving my point that UFOs are seen everywhere on this planet. So now let's move to our next location, which is Lake Havasu, Arizona. This is actually Lake Havasu City. A lot of very interesting cases there, some quite high profile. This is by special request from Leavix Leather. So I really want to thank you for suggesting this location. I've been there before, actually. I've got quite a few friends in Arizona. So it was a fun area for me to explore personally. But yeah, some amazing encounters there, which I think you'll find pretty interesting. So Lake Havasu City isn't huge, 47 square miles, some 60,000 people. The lake is man-made, artificial. It's a very popular tourist destination. And in fact, this area does have a UFO museum. I found 9 cases here. The first was in summer of 1968. This is an impressive case of a solid craft over Lake Havasu. The witness doesn't recall the exact date, but certainly the event remains vivid. As he reported to New Fork, and I quote, "It was a hot day and a clear blue sky. I had just shot up a 3-stage model rocket with a Lizard payload and was walking through the desert trying to recover it. I saw a flash of light come from behind me. When I turned around, there was a chrome cigar-shaped object with no lights or markings, just hanging there right in front of me. It was shaped kind of like a tiny 2-man submarine, totally silent. I stared at it for about 10 seconds, thinking maybe it was a balloon. Then it dipped to one side and disappeared in an instant. It was too close to be an illusion. I remember saying to myself, that was not of this earth. I didn't tell anyone or even remember this until the late 1990s. Now I remember it very clearly. I haven't had anything like that happen again." So this case is interesting for a number of reasons. It's only one of many on record in which toy rockets, not to mention actual rockets, have provoked the appearance of a UFO. I did a whole episode on my channel about this sort of thing. It's also interesting to me that he completely forgot about this encounter, but then it came back to him That always is kind of a red flag indicating possible deeper levels of contact. Certainly a fascinating case. This next one got a lot of publicity. This occurred on March 17, 1969. This was published in several newspapers and UFO journals. It was 3:42 in the afternoon, March 17 again. Two pilots, Herman Slater and Ben Ripley, you can see them here. They took off from Lake Havasu in their Cessna 150. And just 12 minutes later, as they were over the nearby Buckskin Mountains at an elevation of about 5,000 feet, something strange happened. Ben Ripley said he had a very unusual impulse. I'll just quote him. As he says, "I'll never know why I had the urge to unfasten my seatbelt and lean over to look down to the left. But he did, and to his shock, there was a formation of about 25 flying saucers. You can see their drawing here. Now, he didn't say anything to his pilot, Herman Slater, but just pointed at them. And Herman immediately shouted out, 'What the hell are those things?' And as Herman says, 'Then I saw them. I wondered who in the hell could be flying that low, that fast, that far out. There were about a dozen in a kind of center cluster, and the others were grouped around them haphazardly. They weren't jets, sunspots, or not even shadows, since there wasn't a cloud in the sky.' So he described these objects as, quote, 'white, opaque, with a large black stripe leading back on the outer edge from a slight protrusion at the forward section of their oval shape.' He estimates that the objects were about 500 to 1,500 feet above the mountains. They were undulating and dipping, kind of following the contour of the terrain, but all in precise unison. He estimates that these objects were moving at about 250 to 300 miles per hour. Now, Ben Ripley noted that these objects were moving on a course that would take them directly over Havasu City Airport. Both were incredibly shocked by the sight. As Herman Slater says, "My hands broke out in a cold sweat after what we saw in that 15 or 20 seconds." Now, researcher James McDonald, an excellent researcher, interviewed both men and submitted a report to NICAP. Both the pilots agreed that they would never have seen these objects had not Ben Ripley received that very strange impulse to unbuckle his seatbelt and look down and to the left. Now later, it was discovered that at about 15 or 20 minutes after their sighting, a pilot and a co-pilot of a commercial aircraft approaching Phoenix said that they saw, quote, "about a dozen metallic-looking objects flying towards the northwest over the Wight Tank Mountains." Amazing. Now, here's another interesting humanoid case. April 24, 1994. And as the witness says, I'll call her Marianne, that is a pseudonym. She says, "What I went through caused me to pack up my entire home, leave overnight, and move an entire state away." Again, this began on April 24, 1994, around dusk. Her daughter was the only other witness, was 3 years old at the time. They were outside their home in Lake Havasu when suddenly an eerie vacuum of silence descended over the area. Researchers call this the Oz effect. They looked up and saw an immense object moving slowly over their house, only a few hundred feet high. They said this object had 4 large glowing domes, which appeared to be translucent, and inside these she could see, quote, "things milling around inside." The object slowly moved away, leaving nothing but a strange electrical smell. But following the sighting, she learned that the security guard at her place of employment also reported seeing a UFO on the same night. It was just 2 weeks later she arrived home to see a strange, quote, "dark figure" running out of her house through the back kitchen. And other paranormal strange events occurred, which Marianne refuses to talk about as she says they are just too frightening. So after feeling all of this, she started to also feel like she was being watched. She would wake up in the middle of the night in fear. All these odd events were happening. She shared them only with her family because, as she says, "At first I tried to talk about it to others, but after much ridicule I stopped and kept it to myself." Still, she was determined to share her encounter in hopes of receiving some kind of validation. And as she says, "Now, for some reason, my senses are begging me to reach out. So for my own peace of mind, I'll give this one last try. I just want to put this thing to bed." So she reported this all to MUFON. A very profound series of events, certainly for her. All right, moving along, June 30th, 1996. It was 1:10 a.m. when a group of witnesses were outside their home in Lake Havasu and noticed this weird shimmering effect in the night sky, which made the stars seem to sort of jiggle. It was very odd, and it was shortly later they noticed two what they described as iridescent green objects, which were approaching Lake Havasu from the west. They appeared to be flying side by side, but would occasionally seem to fuse together and then separate. As they got closer, this glow faded, and they could now see a solid craft with a kind of oval shape and a flattish rear. There were 3 rows of lights on the bottom, they said, flashing and changing colors. Now, the witnesses believe they may have had missing time, because this sighting seemed to last about 10 minutes. But by the time the objects were gone from view, they noticed that the moon had moved a considerable distance across the sky. So as the witness says, "I sincerely believe this sighting was something important in all of our lives. And the answer to who and what that was will come to us shortly." The next case I'd like to cover occurred on December 24, 2000, Christmas Eve. 2 witnesses were driving through Lake Havasu City when they noticed an egg-shaped craft about 300 feet overhead. They said it had a bright light on top, another on the bottom, and 2 rings of smaller lights around the body of the craft. The bottom light was so bright it appeared to be sending down a beam of light towards the ground, and this object sort of floated back and forth and moved also in an upward direction, occasionally stopping. They went to a friend's house, but by the time they got there, this object had moved to such a distance that it appeared only like a star-like light in the sky, but still brighter than any other star. And they saw it seem to shoot out a small light, blink a few times, and disappear off into the distance. All right, next case. This is a classic daylight disk sighting. It was mid-afternoon on May 15, 2005, when the witness noticed something unusual over Lake Havasu. As he says, "I observed a bright, gleaming silver disk across the lake over a place called Havasu Landing. It appeared to be about a mile up in the sky and some miles away," he said, but he could see that it was moving at right angles and extremely high speeds, and then would occasionally stop and hover. It was close enough that he estimated it was 30 feet wide and 10 feet tall. He went and got his roommates, who also saw it. They were all impressed, and as he says, "It was nothing we have ever seen before. It was a classic silver disk." All right, just a few more cases. September 15, 2006. It was 8 p.m. when a group of people, including a pilot, were all sitting poolside at their home in the center of Havasu City when all the conversation died. Looking up, they saw a 100-foot wide object moving in absolute silence, only about 50, maybe 100 feet overhead. It appeared to be rectangular, but they're not sure because the shape was hard to make out, as there was sort of a fuzzy glow around the perimeter of this object. It wasn't moving that fast. They estimate about 50 miles per hour. Now, the ones who saw it first said that this object was actually at a much higher altitude, but dropped down quite low as it came over their heads and then moved off. As the pilot says, "I had never seen anything like this before." This next case is very brief, but important because it's photographic. This occurred on July 31st, 2009, when a witness was able to actually videotape a daylight disk over Lake Havasu. And this drew the attention of UFO researchers because this is good footage. This video shows a shiny metallic domed disc cavorting over the lake, glinting in the sun. What you see here is just a clip from this videotape. Now the final case in Lake Havasu. This was August 16, 2010, and was published in the Examiner newspaper. A family in Lake Havasu City was watching television when the son looked out the window to see a large, boomerang-shaped object being pursued by 8 jets. The parents and the son stopped watching television to observe this show going on outside their home. They next saw, quote, a bright red light, and this was ahead of the jets. This light stopped abruptly, changed direction. All the jets turned and tried to follow it, and together they raced off into the distance. Now it was just 30 seconds later, a, quote, triangle-shaped object with a deep red light in the center flew overhead, followed minutes again by these jets. Now, to their surprise, the red light was also back, this time trailing the jets. So this went on for the next 45 minutes, this triangle-shaped object and the red light darting back and forth across the sky while the jets vainly attempted to catch up. The witnesses are absolutely convinced that the maneuvers performed by the UFOs were, quote, not possible with currently known technologies. There you go, Leavix Leather. I hope you enjoyed this segment. Lots of cases there. And again, I just want to underline the fact that this is by no means comprehensive. I really didn't cover the cases that involved unexplained anomalous lights because they just don't hold a lot of data, and they're just not nearly as interesting, to me at least, as metallic craft or humanoids, landings, and this sort of thing. So yeah, a lot more cases that I didn't cover because I could spend just hours on any one of these locations. It's amazing to me. All right, now let's move to the next location, which is the small town of Thomasville, North Carolina. This is a really interesting location suggested by the Southern Oracle. Found some very cool cases here, but again, not super large, 17 square miles, about 27,000 people. So I didn't find a whole lot of cases. I found 4 major ones. Again, I could have covered a bunch of anomalous light cases, but really decided to stick to just the really more interesting cases that are not so ambiguous, ones that are genuine UFOs or humanoids. So I think you'll find this pretty interesting, the Southern Oracle. Certainly hope so. Well, let's get started. Well, there aren't a lot of cases in Thomasville. Some of these cases are really impressive. The first one I found occurred on August 18, 1965, and was researched by George Fawcett. He says that the witness observed a metallic cigar-shaped object with purple lights hovering only about 200 feet above the ground. It was, he estimates, about 75 to 100 feet long, 8 to 12 feet wide, and about 10 feet tall, but very close. Most strange was that he could hear it making a sound similar to a sewing machine. He watched it for about 10 minutes, at which point it took off at terrific speed, disappearing from view in about 10 seconds. This next case is astonishing. April 14, 1977. It was about 11 p.m. and the witness was on Old Highway 85 just past Holden Road, heading south towards Thomasville. He was about 19 miles out of town, and this is when he noticed a bright orb in the sky alongside the highway. And as he says, the light was mesmerizing. So he watched this thing hovering above the tree line, occasionally disappearing from view as he drove into Thomasville. So he had just passed the Jacob Street overpass near the Paradise Hotel. This thing had followed him for quite some distance when he saw that this orb-like object had moved much closer, now revealing itself to be a solid object at treetop level. He was very impressed by this sight, so he immediately pulled over next to an 18-wheeler who had also pulled over. He got out of his car and stood next to this trucker, and both of them watched this object in absolute fascination. And as the witness says, it was saucer-shaped, with windows around the edge of the saucer and lights below the windows. He said it was totally silent and had red, blue, and green lights. The bottom was a smooth bowl shape and glowed a kind of amber color. So after watching it together, not saying anything, the witness finally spoke and said, "Do you see that too? Do you hear anything? What is it?" And the truck driver replied, "I see it, but I don't believe it. It's making me feel crazy. I don't hear anything." Now at this point, they both saw something incredibly shocking. As the witness says, "We were both calm but amazed and stunned by what we were seeing. We were both just staring. Suddenly, the silhouette of a small, big-headed body walked to a window and seemed to look down at us. I was shocked." So now, filled with fear and panic, he asked the trucker, "What does it want?" And the trucker replied fearfully, "I hope it's not hungry." So both witnesses simultaneously panicked, ran to their separate vehicles, and took off. Now, when the witness arrived home, he was shocked to see that he was 45 minutes late, which was odd because, as he says, it did not seem like we stood there very long. Lost time, I guess. So there was another interesting endnote to all this, a kind of creepy aftermath to the whole event, when the witness learned that the very next night there was a huge multi-vehicle accident at the very same location on this highway where he saw this craft. As the witness says, "I have told only a few people about this because it sounds crazy. My close encounter of the third kind changed my life. I have no doubt about what I saw. I am convinced we are visited continually by extraterrestrials." This next case is very dramatic. It was investigated by MUFON field investigator Robert Hare. It was 9:15 p.m., March 8, 1996. The witness was driving his pickup truck west on Emmanuel Church Road. Passing a graveyard and a church on his right, this is when he noticed a strange object hovering over an empty field right alongside the road, only about 30 feet off the ground. So he drove by it, very impressed by what he was seeing, and decided to pull a U-turn and drive by it a second time. Still unable to identify it, he pulled another U-turn, watched it a third time, and then pulled yet another U-turn to get a fourth look at it. He said it was disc-shaped, sending down a light blue-green conical beam of light, which got wider as it went down, to, he estimates, a diameter of about 3 feet. He didn't see anything on the ground where it was shining, but he does say that the bottom perimeter of the craft was circled with brilliant red lights that made it difficult to see the top section. On the bottom section, he could see what looked like 4 rocket-like protrusions. They were each glowing with red light, no flames, and as he passed it for the 4th time, this beam of light became extinguished, and the object immediately began to move directly towards him. Soon it was about 10 feet high, right over his truck. He could still see these glowing red lights coming from the bottom protrusions, couldn't hear any sound. It then moved on overhead and began to gain in altitude, and as it moved off, he could see a glowing rectangular light on the other side. It moved off slowly, and after about 15 minutes, it was still visible, although much higher in the sky and very distant, and that was the last he saw it. One final case in Thomasville. It was August 15, 1998, about 5:15 p.m., as a father and son were on a lake fishing in their boat. Suddenly they noticed a flock of small birds flying up from behind them as though startled by something, and looking in that direction, they saw a metallic sphere with a kind of matte pewter finish, hovering only 7, maybe 8 feet above the water and only 20 feet away from them, very close. It was totally silent, and it was hovering but still moving slowly side to side. And after less than a minute of time, it moved off, very slowly at first, then, quote, disappeared at an unbelievable rate of speed. 7 years later, they decided to report it to the National UFO Reporting Center. Thank you, the Southern Oracle. Pretty interesting, huh? Especially that 1977 encounter where the two witnesses saw humanoids and apparently had missing time. It's crazy how many cases there are, no matter where you look. So now let's move to the next location, which is the Isle of Wight. I've always been intrigued by this location in the UK. This comes by special request from Terence Gibbon, and this is a very unusual area. This is a pretty small island, about 147 square miles, 22.5 miles long, 13.5 miles wide. It's got a very interesting history. There's a population of about 140,000 people, but it's a hugely popular tourist destination, attracting millions of people each year. And you can see why, because it's incredibly beautiful. It's UK's sunniest location, and apparently also the most haunted. Very rich history, includes a bunch of dinosaur fossils and just all kinds of really interesting facts that come along with this Isle of Wight. It's got such a long history. But I really want to thank you, Terence, for suggesting this. It contains one of England's most famous and certainly most unusual humanoid cases, and that alone makes it worth looking into this. The first case I could find in the Isle of Wight occurred in January of 1952 and was investigated by UK researcher Jenny Randalls. She reports that she spoke to a man who reported an incredible encounter some 30 years after he experienced it. As she says, I received a call from a man who said he was an RAF radar operator on the Isle of Wight in 1952. He described a tracking of 8 or 9 objects traveling at impossible speeds, although there was no visual backup that he knew of, though this was implied by subsequent developments. He had come to me 30 years on because the Secret Act files operate for only 30 years, and he felt he could now tell the truth. So that's the beginning of the Isle of Wight encounters, but certainly not the end. A very widely viewed and well-authenticated sighting in this area occurred in an early winter morning in 1954 when numerous people described what they call a flaming tadpole. This was bright enough to illuminate the area around it as it was dodging in and out of the clouds. Reportedly, more than half a dozen people saw it over a wide area. One of them was Walter Liggins, a milkman in Newport, again Isle of Wight, and he said this object had a brilliant green glowing head and a red flaming tail. Now, unknown to him, another milkman several streets away, also in Newport, saw this object, and both said it lit up the streets. Interestingly, that same year, Coast Guard officials were puzzled by the appearance of what appeared to be giant footprints. These were found at the edge of a 200-foot cliff. And these prints were huge, 20 inches long, 10 inches wide, clearly imprinted in the recent snow, and very close to the edge of the cliff. So close that it suggested that the creature may have actually fallen off the precipice. But whether this is related to the recent UFO sightings, impossible to say, of course, but certainly interesting and apparently unexplained. 2 years later, August 30, 1956, on this day, Royal Air Force pilot, flight lieutenant, and his navigator, Mr. Wallington, were flying a Javelin jet over Solent. This is between the Isle of Wight and the mainland. They were practicing intercepts with another Javelin jet. The pilot's name is Wilbur Wright, and as he says, I saw a disc-shaped object off my starboard wingtip. It was ahead of me. My navigator obtained a radar return at 19 miles. So he estimates that this object was about 600 feet in diameter. That was his first estimate. He said it maintained its position alongside his right wing. Now the other jet was about a half mile behind, and they could see it both visually and on radar. The pilots all banked steeply and were able to approach within 10 miles of this object. Now Wilbur says, quote, the object was now clearly seen as a metallic gray in appearance. and he could see now that it was larger, so he revised his estimate of its size up to about 1,000 feet across. They approached even closer, within 8 miles of this object, when it suddenly zoomed so fast that the radar couldn't track it. But he estimates its speed was somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 miles per second. 3 years later, August 15, 1959, shortly after the British Interplanetary Society announced the appearance of, quote, mystery satellites, there were 8 observers at the Isle of Wight Moonwatch Station setting up equipment when a fleet of 5 UFOs appeared. They looked like points of light, but they sped overhead on 2 separate tracks, one group and then another, heading towards the south. They were visible for about 2 minutes. None of the witnesses were able to identify the nature of the objects, but absolutely rejected the possibility that they may have been meteors. Next case was investigated by Leonard G. Cramp. He's a pretty famous UK researcher. It was 15 minutes after midnight on July 3rd, 1961, when a mother and daughter, Mrs. Smith and Mrs. Taylor, were outside their home in Ryde. They were bringing in laundry off the line. This is when Mrs. Smith saw what she first thought might be the light of a ship, but her daughter looked and told her that no, this couldn't be a ship, as these lights were clearly in the air, and they were getting closer. So as they watched, these lights revealed themselves actually to be 2 rows of lights, and it soon came close enough that they could see this was in fact a disc-shaped craft with 5 portholes glowing with orange light, pretty much your classic flying saucer. Mrs. Taylor became concerned because, as she says, we thought it was coming straight for us. It soon approached to a distance of about a quarter mile. It was at treetop level. You can see their drawings here. And then it darted away at such fast speed that Miss Smith said it actually made her physically dizzy. They watched it go off into the distance like a shooting star is how they compared it to. And all this was done in perfect silence. But later, looking where the object had hovered, they could see that it had left a glowing ring of light, which persisted for about 5 minutes before finally dissipating. Leonard Cramp did interview the witnesses and was absolutely satisfied of their honesty and their observational abilities, and he also writes, quote, that same evening, several miles away and a little earlier, a friend of mine saw bright lights in a remote field which were preceded by a strange and very local whirlwind. Now this next case is so astonishing. It's a really well-verified, widely viewed case, and it's a schoolyard encounter. This was on July 10, 1967, also investigated by Leonard Cramp. It was 9 a.m. and a group of children were lining up on the school playground to enter their school in Whippingham. Suddenly one of the boys, who Leonard calls John, he saw a milky white object shaped like 2 saucers placed end to end, hovering silently among the trees. He quickly pointed it out to his friends, and they all saw it only briefly before the teacher marched them into the school. They were very excited about this. They could hardly wait for recess an hour and a half later in the hopes of seeing it again, and didn't really expect to. But at 10:30, John was the first out, looked where the UFO had been, but it was gone. But then his friend Kenneth saw it in another position in the sky, still at treetop level. So it apparently had been there for the whole hour and a half. At this point, more than a dozen other kids saw this object moving erratically. They had the impression it was, quote, out of control. They said it was getting lower and finally moved out of sight behind some trees and hedges. They said it was huge, quote, much larger than a double-decker bus. So questioning the boys carefully, Leonard believes this object was probably close to 40 feet wide. And here's an interesting aftermath, because later riding home on the bus, John looked out the window towards where they had seen this craft descending into the fields and saw that the barley crops had been trampled in a straight line right up to the hedge where this object had gone down. So he didn't think or connect this to the object, but a later investigation of these trampled crops showed that some very unusual features. These trampled crops measured anywhere from 3 feet across to 20 feet wide, but they were over 3/4 of a mile in length all the way into another cornfield. And you can see the photos of them here. This is very odd. It looks very much like an object kept touching down, rising up, touching down again. You could possibly call this a UFO crash, or certainly one that seems to be having some difficulties. And an examination of these plants showed that they were sharply cut off. There were weird vortex patterns. As one farmer in the area said, "I have never seen anything like it before." This was far too localized to have been a storm, and as Leonard Cramp says, these marks were, quote, "entirely consistent with the description given by the boys regarding the way the object was moving." They found other strange things. A bird had been killed right where this object apparently landed, and its feathers were distributed over a very wide area. They also found bits of concrete and sticks, looked like they had been carried up and deposited. Later, it was learned that there were other witnesses seeing a UFO moving rapidly across the fields, bobbing up and down. Leonard Cramp calls the marks in the field, quote, "one of the most extensive and up-to-date UFO ground effects on record." They did use a Geiger counter but found no evidence of radiation. But as you can see from these photographs, these are very unusual markings, and although they can't say for sure, they do seem to be connected to this amazing UFO sighting. Moving along, on October 20, 1970, while driving from Shanklin to Ryde to visit a friend, a gentleman known only as Mr. Y noticed a large aircraft covered with lights flying over the marshy area along the River Yar. Puzzled by these lights, he pulled over and saw that this was actually a craft which had a wide ring of at least 7 lights, different colors, cherry red, turquoise, and white, was totally silent. So he continued driving and saw that this object was now moving parallel to his vehicle, as if pacing him. When it moved about 900 feet behind his car, he stopped, got out of his car, and used his flashlight to signal the craft. He then continued driving and says that this UFO followed him. And as he says, "At one time, I thought it intended to land." So he arrived at his destination, his friend's house, and his friend saw it too. He described it as, quote, "playing hide and seek between the treetops," before it finally disappeared. Now following this, Mr. Y began to see orbs of red light hovering in the sky and occasionally following him as he drove. This kept happening to him. And this came to a very interesting conclusion some 2 years later on March 1st, 1972. It was about 9:10 p.m. Mr. Y was sitting on the cliffside of Compton Bay when the tide came in unusually high, and he found himself trapped on the rocks. And this is when he saw 2 yellow lights just 40 feet away, just below the surface of the water. He said they were, quote, "peering up at me like the eyes of some horrible sea monster." So this is a USO. And he thinks the unusual tide that trapped him may have actually been a result of this craft, because after the craft went away, the tide went back out. Mr. Y was able to hike back to his car and drive home. Now this seemed to be the end of it, but in fact it was just the beginning, because it was 1 year later that his 7-year-old daughter, we'll use the name Faye, had an encounter that was destined to become the Isle of Wight's most famous humanoid encounter. It was an encounter that is so strange, it still remains a topic of conversation today. It was one afternoon in May of 1973 that Mr. Y's daughter, again Faye, and her friend, a boy around the same age, were both near Lake Common in Sandown. This is a marshy area, a golf course, not far from the unused Sandown Airport. You can see it here. And this is when they both heard a strange siren-like wailing noise. Curious, they walked towards this noise, which disappeared as they got closer, and they were crossing over this small footbridge over a narrow brook when they saw something very strange. A blue gloved hand with 3 fingers emerged from under the bridge, and of course it was followed by the entire figure. The figure was holding what appeared to be a book, but dropped it in the water. He immediately splashed about to retrieve this object, grabbed it, and the children were now close enough to see that this figure was very tall. They estimate 7 feet tall, and definitely not human. He had no neck. The head appeared to be placed directly on the shoulders. He wore what looked like a pointed yellow hat on his head, had a black knob on the tip, and what looked to them like 2 antennae on the sides. He wore a green tunic with a red collar, white pants, all of which appeared to be worn out and kind of ripped up. He had a white, featureless face, except that there were 2 triangular marks where the eyes would be, flat nostril holes framed by a brown square, and yellow, unmoving lips. There were round markings on his white cheeks, and he had a fringe of red hair, kind of bangs, hanging down over his forehead. So he not only looked strange and was dressed strange, he moved strangely. They said this figure moved in a weird hopping motion, raising its knees abnormally high, and it walked over to what looked to them like a strange metallic windowless hut just a short distance away and disappeared inside it. At this point, the children were about 150 feet away when this figure reappeared, and it was now carrying what looked to them like a black microphone. It had a wire attached to it leading to a device, and it was at this point that this wailing siren noise returned, and it was so loud that it was painful. The boy almost ran away because of it. But the noise very quickly disappeared, and this is when the being began to speak into the microphone, apparently, but the sound echoed all around the 2 witnesses as if this being was right next to them. And it spoke in perfect English. And what it said is interesting. It said, "Hello, are you still there?" And the children felt like the tone of his voice was very friendly, so they moved cautiously closer. They could now see this figure very clearly. It had what looked like wooden slats protruding from his sleeves. Mind you, these are young children, so we're not sure how reliable their descriptions are, but they both saw this. And this being, they said, was barefoot, and they saw that each foot contained only 3 toes. He was holding what looked to them like a large notebook and had written some letters in large print, out of order, but he pointed to them, and basically these words spelled out, "Hello, I am all colors, Sam." So this is when the being began to ask questions verbally, though his lips did not move, and they said the sound seemed kind of muffled, as if someone's mouth was closed. And this being began to ask the children about themselves. They, in turn, asked him questions about his strange clothes and why were they all ripped up. This figure replied that he had only 1 set of clothes to wear. So seeing his strange appearance, they asked if he was a man. And the being, they said, chuckled and said no. They asked him if he was a ghost, and the being replied, "Well, not really, but I am in an odd sort of way." So they said, "What are you then?" And he replied, "You know," with no further explanation other than saying he had no name, that there were others like him, that he was afraid of approaching people because they might hurt him. And this is when this experience escalated to what is apparently what we might call an onboard encounter, because this figure invited the 2 children into this metallic hut. He told them he had just made it, and inside it was strange because it was quite spacious. There were 2 levels with blue-green walls, which they said had a pattern of dials, that had what looked like an electric heater, simple wooden furniture. They went to the upper level, which they said it had a metal floor. This being said he ate berries, that he drank water from the river, but only after he cleaned it. Once inside the hut, he took off his hat. The witnesses could see round white ears, brown hair, and he did this little weird conjuring magic trick by placing a berry in his ear, moved his head forward, it caused the berry to appear in his eye and then to his mouth. Oh, very strange, and it just gets weirder. So they stayed for about a half an hour, then said goodbye. They rushed away and told the first adult they saw about their encounter. He did not believe them. The kids said that there were 2 men, 2 adults nearby during this whole experience, within view, but they did not seem to notice anything strange. So they kept it secret for a little while, but 3 weeks later, Faye did tell her father, Mr. Y, who had previously had some UFO sightings. He was, as you might imagine, utterly astonished, but after questioning his daughter, believed she was describing something she actually experienced. He questioned the boy, and he confirmed all these details. He does feel that her encounter is in some way related to his own, and as he says, quote, "I get the impression that Faye was somehow taken into a bubble of alien reality created by this strange personage. I don't expect many people to believe these strange facts, but my daughter still insists it was a true occurrence." He says that he is both baffled and somewhat embarrassed by the whole ordeal. But yes, a very famous encounter that is still talked about today. It's so odd. Here is a very interesting sighting which occurred on January 14, 1976, just after midnight. Mr. Rod Riddle went to lock the back door of his home in Ryde when something in the sky caught his eye. It was a bright light high up in the western sky. He was puzzled by its strange appearance. He watched it for about 1 minute, trying to identify it, and he noticed it was slowly moving towards him, at he estimates about 30 miles per hour, getting closer. So he quickly called out his wife Jenny, and sure enough, this object descended, hovered briefly, and moved right over their house. They could now see that this object was a dark, rounded object, and as Rod says, the outline was just like a very large hovercraft, rectangular but rounded at the ends. There was no sound whatsoever. And they estimate that it was about 100 feet long, 50 feet wide, and no more than 300 feet over their home, very low. It was in view for about 4 minutes. As it moved overhead, Rod actually walked around the house to keep it in sight and saw it suddenly accelerate upwards and away at fantastic speed. So it looked almost as if it had come down and targeted them and showed itself off to them. The next morning, they reported their sighting to the Royal Air Force at Thorney Island, and it turned out that a meteorological officer had seen a very similar object just 10 minutes before the Riddle's sighting. The officer on the phone told Rod Riddle that they might get a phone call back from the Ministry of Defense. And sure enough, only 5 minutes elapsed when the phone rang. An officer told him, quote, "We are extremely interested," and proceeded to question him all about the details of his sighting. This was interesting and kind of ironic because the Ministry of Defense had long professed that there was nothing to the UFO subject. The Riddle sighting, much to their chagrin, became publicized, causing them unwanted attention. But they did learn that there were other witnesses. As a police spokesman said, "We understand something similar was reported in the Bembridge area about a week earlier. We just cannot explain it." But they found out there was a third witness to the Riddle sighting. A married couple were driving into Ryde at about 8:15 on that same night when they saw a brilliant orange-gold object reflecting the setting sunlight, and it looked to them like a fuselage, but there were no wings, no tail visible, just this strange whirling light underneath this object, and they didn't think too much about it until the Riddle sighting was published in the local newspaper. Next case, February 1976, just before 1 a.m., Laura Hill woke up in her home at 34 Briar Close in Fort Gomer. She had to check on her daughter who had recently broke her leg, and returning to her bedroom, she looked out the window and saw a large object move quickly across the sky. She described this as, quote, "oval, large, and a solid disc of light ringed in a glow." She said it made a terrific whooshing noise. And it moved in a straight line across the sky. Clearly not a meteor, she said. And she later learned that 8 people had recently reported seeing UFOs to the Ministry of Defense, and she wonders if she had seen the same object they did. The next case actually involved a mini wave of sightings which struck the Isle of Wight in October of 1978. A lady, Mrs. Gadd, reported seeing a, quote, "bright and large double light, which could not have been a street light or a star." She said it moved right over her home on Hinton Road in Carisbrooke, And this was not the first time she had seen a UFO, but this was one of the more dramatic sightings. However, it was just a few days later that her husband, Mr. J. Gadd, was awoken by his cat pawing at the door, and looking out his window, he saw a, quote, flying saucer descending very slowly. He said it appeared to be hovering over the Victoria Recreation Grounds near his home. So he quickly woke his wife, and together they watched this object for a few moments until it moved off. And Mr. Gadd described this sighting as, quote, frightening and incredible. A third sighting occurred just a few days later to the wife of Reverend C. Target and their son Lucian. They were driving near Atherfield Bay when they noticed an extremely bright flashing light descending towards the horizon. And as she says, it could not have been a plane because it was too large, too bright, and not accompanied by any noise. Just a few more sightings. The Isle of Wight. This sighting was actually from the mainland in Sherborne. The witness, Rita Griffiths, says that she and her neighbor, Wendy Wilkinson, were saying good night when they noticed a cylinder-shaped object with different colored lights overhead. And as Rita says, it was a sort of object which had a long undercarriage underneath, revolving, and there was a blue light in the middle. It was there for about an hour, just hovering and coming down and going up very slowly. So they watched this object actually release an orange sphere which darted at very high speed directly towards the Isle of Wight. And although the night was very cold, as Rita says, all of a sudden we were burning hot and didn't feel the cold at all for 10 or 15 minutes. We are not a couple of nutters, far from it. I have seen things in the sky that can't be explained before. I truly believe in this sort of thing, and it doesn't worry me. Next case, September 28, 1980. It was late at night. Derek Fuller was driving to his home in Ventnor. His car was the only one on the road when he noticed a glowing, arrowhead-shaped object only about 200 feet above the ground to his right. And as he says, I was completely mystified. I had never seen anything like it before. It was difficult to estimate its size, but it was much bigger than my car, and it could have been as much as 40 feet across. So we watched it for about 1.5 minutes as it moved at about 50 miles per hour, grew dim, and then vanished. It's amazing how many sightings there are. Just 3 more. January 21st, 1982, Muriel Upton and her friend Alethea Richard were at their home on Wilberforce Road in Bristone. And this is when they noticed a gold-colored sphere low in the western sky. And listen carefully to her description. As she says, it appeared to have poles sticking out of the side of the circular shape, and was stationary at first, and then dropped slowly down. Then it turned very bright red, lighting the sky around it before disappearing as if someone had turned off a switch. Now, bearing in mind that description, here's what the Coast Guard later said. They said that the ladies had probably seen Venus, and that the poles they described were created by the refraction of light. Now, the witnesses probably do not feel this way because, as they said, this sighting caused them both, quote, fear and excitement. I don't know, maybe it was Venus, maybe not. Hard to say for sure. Here's the next case. May 19, 1985, 9 p.m. Mr. Eric Spanner was enjoying the view from the Rue Down near Ventnor. It was an unusually quiet evening, he said, when he noticed a star-like light about a half-mile out to sea, and it was so low over the water that it looked to him like it had actually come out of the water. You might call this a USO. But after watching it for a few moments, he saw that it was now moving towards the shore, not far from his location. As it reached the shore, it rose up and began to follow the contour of the terrain about 60 feet above the ground, then stopped and hovered over a set of red brick houses along Down Road just across the valley from where he stood. And he could now see that it was a glowing, disc-shaped craft, probably about 8 feet in diameter, with 2 lights on top. Now, it then moved, veering in his direction, close enough that he could now hear a faint whining noise, and his curiosity turned to alarm when it began to swerve towards him. And he thought to himself, "My God, it's seen me! It's coming towards me!" It soon came to within 100 feet of him and went by him, to his relief, right over a nearby 12-foot-high hedge, and then disappeared behind it. So he ran to keep it in view, but it was gone. He reported to the police and learned that the Royal Navy was conducting radar tests near this area. Now, Eric himself is not convinced he necessarily saw an ET craft, but he knows that it definitely was not a helicopter, as this theory was put forth. He did write to the Navy about it, but received no response. Newspaper reporters also made queries to the Navy, and they were told that the Navy, quote, has no record of any of these sightings in its files. Here's a final case. August 1989. It was 5 minutes before midnight, August 3rd, when Dory Smith looked out the window of her home located on St. Edmund's Walk in Wootton, and she saw a, quote, brilliant white object in the sky. Looking at it, she could see that it was, quote, completely round and a mass of lights. It went right over the house. So it's a brief sighting, but pretty close up. She phoned authorities, but the island police said that they had received no other reports of strange objects in the sky. Thank you, Terrence. I hope you found that interesting. I sure learned a lot. It's amazing to me how many cases there are for a relatively small area. That Sandown clown case. Yeah, world famous, one of the most unusual I've ever heard. I always wanted to take a deeper look at it. So interesting, so unusual. So thanks again for suggesting this location. Amazing. So there you go. 4 new locations across the planet, each with a long and rich history of UFO encounters. Should come as no surprise. I keep telling you, UFOs are ubiquitous. These things are seen everywhere. And this proves 3 major points, to me at least. One is that UFOs are far more common than people realize. 2 is, yeah, they're visiting every location on this planet, which I think goes to show that the ETs, and I do think that's what we're dealing with here, the ETs are conducting what amounts to a publicity campaign, announcing their presence. I can only speculate, but I think that they want us to know that we are not alone. And I think this series, the Hometown series, proves that almost unequivocally. It's with so many cases, one has to explain why. Why would they visit every single location on this planet? Perhaps it is just for purposes of scientific exploration, but some of these cases look very much like what UFO researchers call a display. So yeah, I do think they want to be noticed. But amazing how just in these 4 locations, the entire UFO phenomenon is represented. You could learn pretty much all you need to know about UFOs from one location. So that is really cool. That's it for today. Thank you guys. I hope you enjoyed this latest installment of UFOs in your hometown. If you have a location you'd like me to look up, please feel free to send it my way. But also please be patient. My list now of locations is almost at 1,000. And some locations I'm having a little bit of a hard time with. Some because they are very small, not very populated locations, and it's hard to find a case there. But more commonly, it's because these locations have too many cases. And when there's a lot of cases, it makes it very difficult to research. But I'm doing my best. So thanks again for all of you who suggested a location. I truly appreciate it. Thanks for watching. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. And most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.